In this series, we discuss the basic technical aspects of time-lapse photography, the minimum required gear, and we will go out and capture a time-lapse sequence and address the thought process as we set up the camera. Finally, we edit and render the time-lapse video on the computer and discuss software options. Hello beautiful people, how is everybody doing, and welcome to part 4 in this video series. In this part we will go ahead and use Adobe Lightroom to edit the time-lapse sequence which we captured in part 3 of this series, and after that we will use Adobe Premiere Pro to create our final time-lapse video file. And finally I will go ahead and show to you guys some other software alternatives that can be used to edit and render your time-lapse sequences. Because Lightroom is arguably the more commonly used software among photographers, I figured it would be wise to get started here in Lightroom. So without further ado, let's get right into this. The first advice that I would like to share with you guys has to do with the file handling menu. As you can see under build previews, we have different options. So let's go ahead and discuss what they do differently. As you can see, there are 4 different import settings, 1 by 1, standard, embedded and sidecar, and minimal. Since our time-lapse sequence has hundreds and hundreds of shots, I would want to choose minimal because the import process will be very fast this way. Using embedded and sidecar will display the largest possible preview from the camera, which will require some time. Standard and 1 by 1 will also be more demanding. So once again, due to efficiency reasons, I would go with minimal if you have a very big time-lapse sequence. So for efficiency reasons, I will go ahead and choose minimal as my build preview setting. And as you can see, once I hit import, everything will import within a few seconds, even though I've got, I believe, 540 large raw image files. As you can see, everything imported quite fast. So let's go on the develop module and get things started. Okay, the very first thing we will do is enable profile corrections and then remove chromatic aberration to get that out of the way. If you have been watching parts 3, you may remember that I had purposely underexposed every shot in this time-lapse sequence using exposure compensation and exposing every picture with -1 stop. And I did that to preserve as much available dynamic range, making sure that my highlights are not losing any details. And as you can see, my highlights look pretty good. But now's the time to add back that 1 stop of exposure to adjust things back to normal. But because we had initially exposed everything for the highlights and we preserved that dynamic range, we can now bring down the highlights all the way and gain back all of that detail in the highlights. Very nice. Now the next thing we will do is open up the shadows. We could open up the shadows all the way to 100. As you can see, the dynamic range is pretty good, but I do not recommend always opening up the shadows all the way. It does take away some of the contrast throughout your image frame if you open up the shadows all the way. Plus we want to keep things a little bit more realistic, and I personally do like leaving a little bit of mystery in my shadows, if that makes sense. So I'll leave it right around plus 62, but we will not go all the way. Now with the whites, I'm going to play around here a little bit visually and kind of get an idea what I can do. We do have to keep in mind that later on the sun comes out and things get brighter, so I'm going to keep the whites at a very conservative level, something like plus 22, maybe even a little bit lower. Now I'm going to press Alt on my keyboard and then bring down the blacks, and I'm going to crush the blacks just a little bit, maybe something like -34. Excellent. Now clarity is a tool that can be overused at times, just like contrast. But since I've got these nice rocks here in the foreground, I do want to add a little bit. We will not go beyond plus 12, but just a little bit, just to give it a little bit of definition here in the rocks. And then since the sun is setting in this time-lapse sequence, I will go ahead and warm up the overall color temperature, and I'm going to give it a little bit of a pink tint. This is going to look nice eventually as the sun comes out. So we can now go ahead and sharpen our image. I'm gonna mask my sharpening effect, not a lot of outlines. So a masking of like 90. And since I used my base ISO of 64, there is not really a lot of image noise. So I'm gonna keep my noise reduction very conservative with a value of 12 at luminance. Now we could go ahead and also perhaps use a lookup table, give it a nice creative look perhaps. Artistic 3 doesn't look too bad. I actually kind of like that. So just for fun, we can use a lookup table. What lookup tables basically do, they basically change the way Lightroom is interpreting your raw image file. So it's a little bit different than having a preset. A preset is basically like an Instagram filter. You add certain effects, but using a lookup table just completely changes how your image is interpreted to begin with. We can also change the amount up here. Maybe we can, I'll bring up the amount to 130, but I am actually thinking at this point, I will bring up the overall exposure a little bit more than what I had before, so 1.2 stops. So now, as I have the first image selected, which we edited, I'm going to press Ctrl and A on my keyboard to select every picture, and then we will click Sync, and then I'm going to check all and click Synchronize. Now this will take our settings from this one edited image and it will synchronize it through all of the 540 pictures that we have in our sequence. I'm going to click File, go under Export, and then we will go ahead and export our image sequence. So exports, and now we will go ahead and export the time-lapse sequence. I will go ahead and keep image format at JPEG, color space sRGB, and image size I'll leave at 100% as well, quality 100. Great, so let me go ahead and click export, and once all of this has exported, we will go ahead and launch Premiere Pro and create our time-lapse video file. Now that Lightroom has successfully exported our time-lapse sequence, it's time for us to create the final time-lapse video file using Adobe Premiere Pro. Now before we do anything, we want to determine how many pictures, how many frames per second are we going to use to create this video file. So in Premiere Pro, we'll go under Edit first, and then Preferences, and then go under Media. Here, the very first setting, which has Media Time Base, we can choose the frames per second. Let's do a little bit of math. So we've got 540 pictures in the time-lapse sequence. If we divide that by, let's say, 30 frames per second, we get a time-lapse as long as 18 seconds. If we did, let's say 540 divided by 24 frames per second, we would now, of course, get a longer time-lapse of 22 seconds, because we would use less frames per second. 60 frames per second is very nice because it will turn out very smooth, but it does demand a lot more pictures for each second. So let's say if we did 60 frames per second, we would only end up with a 9-second time lapse, which isn't actually too bad as I'm thinking about it. So let's go ahead and actually, then we could also use 48 frames per second. Let's do 48 frames per second because we would get something like, whoops, we would get a time lapse of about 11 seconds and it would be somewhat smooth. So let's do 48 frames per second, but keep in mind that 24 frames per second is usually the go-to. So let's click OK. Now let's click under File, New, Project, and then we'll create a new project file. Once the new project is created, under the Assembly module, we can, where it says Import Media to Start, double click to import our time-lapse sequence, and all we have to do is click on the very first image in this time-lapse sequence, and then make sure that this box that says image sequence is checked, and once we hit open, Premiere Pro will put all of the 540 pictures onto one stack, and here we've got the stack. It says 11 seconds right there. We click and drag it onto the timeline, and boom, boom. Here is our time-lapse. Now keep in mind, because the time-lapse sequence is consisting of all of these high-resolution pictures, playing it back in Premiere Pro in its current state is going to lag, even if we play with only a quarter of the resolution. But we can kind of get an idea, and things are looking kind of nice. Now, as you can see, there is something else that's happening aside from the stuttering eventually. There is this flickering, they call it, which is your picture going bright, dark, bright, dark, bright, dark. It kind of goes back and forth. That's what you call flickering. And this happens very naturally as you capture a time-lapse sequence and you have intervals between each picture that you're taking. Because there is a given amount of time, a significant amount of time between each picture. In this case, we had 6-second intervals. The exposure does change a little bit between those intervals, and that's how that flickering eventually occurs. Now, when you record a normal video out of your camera, you're recording with 30 frames per second right then and there, so that flickering is not really going to happen. But once again, because of those intervals, this flickering happens. So what can we do? we can use a plugin. It's called Flicker Free. You can download this and install it for Premiere Pro and After Effects. You simply click on it and drag it onto your time lapse, and bam, it will take care of the flickering. In most cases, it'll help with the flickering, but if it's very, very strong flickering in like a holy grail time lapse or something, it may not be sufficient. So you may want to use a more professional and specific time lapse software like LR Timelapse, which we will talk about in another video. So now that we have Flicker Free applied to the clip, I'm going to go under File, Export Media, and I'm going to export this as 4K. So under H264, there are some 4K presets. The YouTube 4K preset is just fine. The Vimeo 4K preset does have a higher bitrate, so I'm going to use that one. And then I'm going to go ahead and click export. Well, there is no audio that we're using. That's fine. I'm going to go ahead and click export. And then once that is exported, we'll check out the clip. And that's how you capture and create a time-lapse video. If you guys have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me or simply leave a comment down below. I'm always very good about responding to each and every one of you. Now, what about software alternatives? Adobe Lightroom is a great program and it does take care of the job, but Lightroom does require you to have a monthly subscription with Adobe where you pay $10 every month. Now, I personally like to use Luminar and Aurora HDR because they also have batch processing functions, so you can easily create a preset and then use that preset to batch process all of the other photos in your time-lapse sequence. Now, I have made videos about that kind of workflow, so you should definitely check it out. It's on my channel. I'll leave the links in the video description down below. Just to quickly show you guys what I'm talking about, here we've got Aurora HDR 2019 and here's Luminar 2018. Let's just use Aurora HDR very quickly just to kind of give you guys an idea what I'm talking about. And by the way, a lot of the time-lapse footage I've been showing throughout this video series, I've actually processed using Aurora HDR and Luminar. So let's just pick a picture here towards the end of the time-lapse sequence where the sun was nice and saturated. What I really like about Aurora HDR and Luminar are not only the effects that you can achieve that you cannot really achieve in Lightroom, but the way the files are handled in these programs will give you different sort of effects. Now, the detail that you can get out of Aurora HDR, for example, is tremendous, and also some of the vividness. Now, every program handles files differently and every program gives different results, and it is sort of subjective. But Aurora HDR, for example, has really made itself a great reputation for detail and strong HDR effects. Now, what's really cool in both of these programs, you have a lot of wonderful presets. I mean, just from the get-go, you could choose like a nice HDR preset, and as you can see, bam, before and after, you get some very nice and appealing looks here. You also have some effects, as I mentioned, that you could not really that you don't really have available in Lightroom. So very interesting. Make sure to check out the video description down below if you're interested in this. As I've mentioned, I have made video tutorials where I demonstrate how you can use these programs to create your own preset and then use the presets to batch process the entire time-lapse sequence. You will, however, still need a program like Premiere Pro, for example, to create the final video file, because these programs will be able to edit your photos and your time-lapse sequences. But in order to create the video, you will need a separate program. And having said that, I think that sums up our video. I've been jumping from topic to topic because, quite honestly, I did not really know how to end this video. But I think you guys get the idea. Once you have your sequence captured, you will batch process your sequence, and then you will use a video software to turn all of the pictures into a video file, and that's pretty much how it goes. If you guys have any questions, if you're confused on anything, do not hesitate to let me know down below. Once again, check out the videos on Luminar and Aurora HDR. I will leave the links in the video description down below. Also, if you happen to be interested in Aurora HDR or Luminar, you can get a $10 discount if you use my coupon code Massimo. I will leave that information in the video description down below as well. And I think that sums it up. If I do make a part 5 in this video series, it will be about motion control systems when you're capturing your time-lapse sequence. But that may be a little while. I have some other content that I would like to get out, so stay tuned for that. And having said that, that sums it up. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.